watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael, doing our second show for the day, joined by Mr. Robert Spencer, returning after his recent debate with Dr. Javed Hashmi, and also co-host here, Louis Dizon, who's also returning, who is moderating the debate. Louis, how are you first? Let me ask you.
I'm great. It's always happy to be here.
Excellent. And our guest, Mr. Spencer, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Glad to have you back on. I really look forward to hearing your thoughts, this post-debate interview. Just like to hear how you think it went down, and we'll ask some specific questions as we get into it. But first, before that, there was an interesting development that seemed to have happened after the debate on Twitter that I don't really know anything about. I'm not really familiar with Dr. Hashmi beyond the few exchanges that we had setting up the debate and the debate itself. But it sounds like there was some history there, because he was saying that he's now revealing that he was Danios, I guess, who has written and interacted with you in the past. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. It's all become kind of a soap opera over the last few days, and very strange developments that actually started, as you noted, right after the debate. I don't think I had even gotten up from this chair, and I saw on Twitter that Dr. Hashmi had revealed that he was indeed Danios, who was a writer at a website called Loonwatch, which is no longer operative, but it was a website, a really vicious website that was full of personal attacks, slanders, smears, defamation of the absolutely most vile kind, directed at me and against pretty much everyone who opposes jihad violence and Sharia oppression of women and others. And Danios, about 10 years ago, he and I had quite a lot of interaction. He wanted to debate, but he wouldn't do it he wouldn't do it. He would only do it anonymously. And the people who I had set up the debate with didn't want that. They wanted a debate with an actual person. He wanted to have a televised debate with his face covered, and they said, no, we're not going to go for that. And then he refused.
Wait. He wanted to do the debate with his face covered?
Yeah. I had set it up with the Assyrian Broadcast Network. Back in those days, they're a wonderful outfit of Christians from Iraq who have a television network that goes to the Middle East and to the Assyrian communities worldwide. And it's based in the Detroit area. I used to go out there a few times, actually every month for a while, and do shows with them. And so we were going to set up this debate with ABN. But when he said he had to have his face covered, they thought, well, this is bad television,
Well, I can't ask him because he's declined to do a follow-up interview. Yeah, I mean, he originally agreed, but he's declined, at least for the time now. So I can't ask him. So did he tell you why the anonymity for so long?
Well, he said that it was important that he maintain his anonymity. And I thought at the time, because Loonwatch, as I noted, contained very, very low-level polemic. There was indeed a lot of purported refutation of my work, much of which that he wrote, but also just absolutely adolescent, vicious personal attacks. And I was actually looking at the time for the possibility of being able to sue him for libel or defamation or something of that kind. And so I think that was why he wanted to maintain himself anonymous, because he knew that I would sue him if I found out who he was. Now, the funny thing is that he made this great reveal after the debate and noted that I never would have agreed to the debate if I had known he was Danios. And that's true, because this is somebody who behaved in an absolutely abominable manner. But the strange thing is that I'm not sure that, people are saying, oh, that's so great. You fooled him and made him debate you and so on. And I think, okay, well, you can have your fun, but really to behave in such an unethical manner and be so actively misleading, I think is kind of strange behavior for somebody who's connected with Harvard University and so on.
Well, I wish I could have heard his side of the story and the rationale behind it. I did find it odd that all of a sudden, right after the debate, he would reveal that he's been this figure who has written, interacting with you for many, many years. I didn't understand why all of a sudden now make that revelation.
Well, just one other thing, if I may, about this. There is a website online. I can give you the URL, but in any case, it was written by somebody who donated to Danios because he had said he was going to write a book refuting all my work. This was in 2013 or 14. He raised $8,000, but never came across with the book. And so this woman wrote this website saying that he had defrauded the people who gave the $8,000 and that he should return it. Now, he has actually tacitly acknowledged that this is true by noting that he's going to donate $8,000 to, I think, a children's hospital or something. It's strange and unethical behavior.
Well, he tagged me in a few others in a message about donating $8,000, and I had no idea what he was talking about.
Yeah,
that's the context.
Yeah.
I should also add that based on what he said, he fully intended at the time to write that book. It's just that as time went on, he found himself too busy to get around to it. So there was no intentional intent to like swindle people of their money.
Great. I think the people who gave the money should get the money back, but that's just my opinion.
But I guess he's going to say that he's going to donate it to charity. Louis, did he say when he's going to do that? I'm just curious.
Yes, that's what he said.
Okay. All right. Well, let's move on beyond that. But I mean, I just do want to make this very clear. When he was writing as Danios, you do maintain that he personally slandered you. Was vicious to you, because I haven't seen any of these exchanges, but I just want to make sure I understand your perspective.
Okay. Absolutely. If it had just been him saying, these things are wrong, these things are false, whatever, in my books, we could have had an exchange. But when you have somebody who's just going so low, it's I don't think, life's too short to indulge that kind of thing.
Well, hopefully we'll be able to hear his side of it. But I don't know when that will be, but I mean, the door's open for him if he wants to. But so let's go ahead and dive into your analysis of the debate. Tell me your first impression. How do you think it went?
Oh, I think it went very well. Of course, he had a more difficult task because it's quite obvious when you look at the world today that the problem of terrorism is pretty much uniquely Islamic. There are other kinds of terrorists, but there's a notable absence of people screaming Jesus is Lord and blowing themselves up, or people who are of other religions citing their religious texts and justifying violence on that basis. So I think he had an uphill battle from the start, and his premise was essentially false all the way through, that somehow violence done by Christians 1,000 years ago or 800 years ago is equivalent to violence by Muslims today. The fact is that there is a unique problem with Islamic terrorism in the world today. And we can have all kinds of historical discussions. I'm perfectly happy to do that. But it's noteworthy that he never came up with an adequate answer to my continued repeated question of why is it that this stopped? If all these things are true that you're saying, which I'm not sure that they were, then why did Christians stop doing this? And on what basis can we hope to bring about a situation in which Muslims stop doing this? And these questions remained unanswered.
Do you felt that you had, I know there was a portion where it was kind of timed, but that part of the debate where it was kind of a free-for-all format, do you felt like you had enough time to really get the points in that you needed to get in, or not really?
Well, here again, I'm sorry to say this, but I think there was an ethical problem here. It's a common debater's tactic to continually interrupt the other speaker. And it's kind of an unethical debater's tactic as far as I'm concerned. I don't indulge in it myself. And the idea is to sidetrack the discussion whenever you have a point that is getting too uncomfortable for the person who's doing the interrupting. So, for example, I would have wanted to speak more about the authoritative teachings of the various schools of Islamic jurisprudence calling for Muslims to wage war against unbelievers and subjugate them. These are legal pronouncements that are unanimous among the various Islamic schools of law. And when I started to quote them, he cut me off, and then I had to deal with whatever it was he said when he cut me off, and then the whole thing gets diverted, and it's moving so quickly that you never end up getting back to the points that needed to be made. And so this is one thing that I think that it probably would have been wiser to have none of that kind of free discussion and just more time back and forth with each of us, and then there's no interruption problem.
Yeah, I can definitely see where you're coming from there. So one thing that jumped out at me, I think it was in his opening presentation, and I want to get your thoughts on it. I know you weren't able to address everything because it was kind of like a fire hydrant. There were a million claims going out. It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible to address them all. One of them was that Samson was a suicide bomber.
Yes.
He explicitly likened Samson to a suicide bomber. Could you maybe comment on that? What do you think about the claim that Samson was a suicide bomber in his action?
Certainly, yes. We can grant the idea that he's doing the same kind of thing because he is performing an act that is killing various enemies and dying, knowing that he's going to die himself in the process. However, to say that Samson, to use the modern terminology, and to say that Samson is a suicide bomber is extraordinarily misleading, because there is absolutely no example of anyone in Jewish history or Christian history who has ever said, I'm going to kill all these people, even though I'm going to die in the process, because Samson did it. There has never been, in other words, an interpretative tradition in Catholicism, in Orthodoxy, in any Protestant tradition that says Samson is exemplary in this. And in the Quran, it actually promises paradise to those who kill and are kill and are killed for Allah. This is the 9th chapter of the Quran, verse 111. And so if you have a promise of paradise, and you understand this is within a theological framework in which your good deeds and your bad deeds are placed on scales. And if your bad deeds outweigh your good deeds, you go to hell. Now, the problem with that is it can drive you crazy because nobody really knows what a deed weighs or how many good deeds or bad deeds he has. And so you want to have something that's going to guarantee that you're going to go into paradise. This is the Quran's only guarantee of paradise if you kill and are killed. And this is a tremendous inducement for suicide bombing that is explicitly invoked by Islamic theologians in order to justify exactly that. And so it's in stark, direct, diametric opposition to the understanding of the Samson story in both the Jewish and Christian traditions.
Yeah, because as you say, I don't know anybody who has ever interpreted Samson in the story that way. In fact, I can recall St. Augustine in The City of God explicitly rejecting the idea that a Christian should commit suicide. He thinks that it's absolutely forbidden. There's no way that you could do that. So I sure don't think that even that the one of the greatest interpreters, I think, of sacred scripture, St. Augustine, I don't think that was the conception that he had when he read it. But there was another part kind of early on in the debate where you said that he was condescending, I believe. I think that was the term.
Yeah.
What was it that gave you the impression that he was speaking to you in a condescending manner? Because I think you actually mentioned it several times.
Well, it's a ongoing attitude that I think that he shares with pretty much every other Islamic spokesman I've ever debated, going back 20 some years. It's an arrogance that I think is born out of the Quran's identification of Muslims as the best of people on earth, enjoining what is right and forbidding what is wrong, which is chapter 3, verse 110, versus the non-believers being the most vile of created beings, as is noted in chapter 98, verse 6. And he was building on that to say, well, he's a real scholar, and that his works are scholarly, and that he has delved more deeply into these issues. Really, this is a red herring, because these are not really issues that you have to have some kind of tremendously detailed or difficult study or specialized knowledge in order to understand. What you have to look at is simply the Islamic scripture and how is it interpreted in mainstream Islamic traditions versus the Christian scripture and how it is interpreted in mainstream Christian traditions. This is something that many times is obfuscated, actually, more than illuminated by these analyses that come out of the universities today, because they have their well, you know, for example, Hashmi himself is in the Al-Walid Center for Islamic Studies at Harvard. Al-Walid bin Talal is a Saudi prince who showers millions, hundreds of millions of dollars on American universities and turns them into essentially vehicles for Islamic proselytization. And so the Al-Walid Center for Islamic Studies at Harvard is never going to look at this issue with any kind of fairness, because they're paid not to. And same goes at Georgetown and many others.
You know, along the lines of the part where you were saying you felt he was condescending, what do you think about the comments where he started correcting your pronunciation of things, even though he wasn't able to pronounce some Latin terms himself? Even though he that was an issue, he would correct your pronunciation, and he started to ask, "Do you read Arabic? Do you read Arabic?" What did you think of that?
Well, that's a big dodge, because many times over the years, people have said, when I quote, and I've seen it happen to many other people as well, if you quote an inconvenient passage of the Quran, they'll say, well, you see, you have to really know the Arabic to understand that. And that's actually the same kind of pseudo-academic obfuscation that I was alluding to just a minute ago. The idea that you have to understand Arabic in order to understand Islam is, in the first place, belied by the fact that most Muslims in the world today are not Arabs, not native Arabic speakers, don't speak Arabic except when they memorize the Quran and when they pray in the mosques. And they may have little or no understanding, actually, of the content of those prayers or the content of those Quran readings. The idea that you have to understand Arabic in order to understand Islam would completely disenfranchise probably about 70% of the Muslim population in the world and make them second-class Muslims. The fact is that when it comes to me and Arabic, I have actually studied Arabic, and I can actually read Arabic. I'm not fluent in Arabic, and when they speak, it goes way too fast for me to get. And so I mispronounced a couple of words. Absolutely. I have no hesitation in acknowledging that. It's the same thing with Greek. I actually do some work translating some Greek for a Greek organization. And they understand that when they speak to me, it's going to go right by me. But when I can sit down and look at it, I can understand it. Now, the point is that the idea that when you're working with Muslim translations made by Muslims for Muslims, Muslim documents published by the Saudis, published by the Darul Uloom Deoband in India, published by various Islamic organizations translating Islamic texts, to say that you can't reason from that basis to various conclusions is just an obfuscation. It's the short answer to this is, it's as if you're saying that kill them wherever you find them, which is in the Quran at 2:191, 489, and then 9:5 is kill the unbelievers wherever you find them, the idolaters wherever you find them. That kill them wherever you find them, when you read it in Arabic, really means give them a hug and buy them a coffee.
I want to ask one more question before I pass it to Lewis. I have a lot more, but I want to get him in the picture here. But one more before I pass it on. Do you feel there was a little bit of carpet bombing going on, especially at the closing statement, which to my knowledge, during a closing statement, you're not supposed to add any new information. You're supposed to kind of summarize what you had already given. But it seemed like there was a little bit more going on in the closing statement. Is that your impression? And number two, do you think that there was some carpet bombing going on?
Well, yeah. In the first place, let's be completely fair here. He has accused me since then of doing exactly what you're saying, because I said that I listed off various ways in which Islam is uniquely violent, which was the topic of the debate, in the closing statement, because I simply hadn't had an opportunity to get them in before that. I don't think that was introducing new material. He thinks it is, because I was thinking that this is a debate about this question, and so these things are pertinent. And anyway, by that time, he was talking about how terrible the United States is and how it's the cause of modern day Islamic terrorism. I think you're absolutely right in terms of carpet bombing. He was speaking extraordinarily quickly, not really dealing with what points I made at all, ignoring the points I made, and then reading off his PowerPoint, even in the rebuttal. And he's been going around boasting, saying, yes, I did this because I knew everything he was going to say. Well, if that was true, then he should have answered it. But he actually left my core points unanswered because he had not anticipated them in his PowerPoint.
Yeah, I think there was actually a point where kind of towards the beginning you were saying, I mean, that was a really well prepared answer, except it doesn't address anything I just said.
Yes, exactly. And you know how he's here again, you see that arrogance and condescension, that he's saying, oh, he knows all about me. He's in my head and thus can completely anticipate everything I'm going to say, write out his PowerPoint for it, and boom, demolish me. And the only problem is that I was actually there ready to have a discussion and made actual points that he didn't even attempt to address.
Yeah. Louis, go ahead and jump in here with comments and questions.
Yeah. Okay. So before I begin, I just want to say, like, I've actually followed your work for close to 10 years now, and I've actually had a chance to read quite a bit of your work. I actually have my personal copy right here of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam. This is the only one that I actually have as a physical book, because the rest I either read electronically or borrow from the library. But I do want to make note of one particular book that you wrote a while back, and that's the book, Did Muhammad Exist?, where you argued that a lot of the episodes in the life of Muhammad are historically inauthentic. Now, this to me raises this one question, because in your arguments for the thesis that Islam is exceptionally violent, you appeal a lot to the hadiths and to the seerah of Muhammad. However, like appealing to these documents would presuppose a certain degree of historical authenticity, and if, as your book's thesis would suggest, these episodes are actually not historically inauthentic, then wouldn't be a moot point to appeal to these episodes in the first place?
Well, actually, I think the one part of your question, that the premise I would disagree with, is that you have to have these incidents be historical for them to be influential. Actually, the question of Islamic doctrine, what does Islam teach, is answered by studying the Quran and the Hadith and the Sirat Rasulullah, the biography of Muhammad. So that's the content of, that's the source material for Islamic teaching. But the question of the historical reliability of those sources is a separate question. It's like this. If we're talking about Macbeth, the play by Shakespeare, we can say Macbeth said this, and Lady Macbeth said, out damned spot, and so on and so on, and talk about what Macbeth said and did in the play. But there is no assumption when we're discussing Macbeth that we're talking about historical characters or historical events. And so it's the same thing here. When we're talking about Islamic doctrine, what Muslims believe, then we have to go to the Hadith. But that doesn't mean that we are assuming that the Hadith are historically reliable or that they are historically reliable.
All right, that is a fair point. It does bring to mind one closely related sub-question to that, though. And as many people who have studied Hadiths know, there is like a massive amount of material in there, and who knows, which is authentic, which is not. But because it's such a massive body of material, you could pretty much find whatever you want in there. So yeah. It's true. Some of these militant fundamentalist Muslims, if they really wanted to justify their interpretation of Islam, they can find something in the Hadith corpus to justify that. But by the same token, someone who might want to interpret Islam in a more, liberal, humanistic light, they could they could undoubtedly find material in the hadith as well that they could, grab onto and form their own version of Islam out of.
Yeah, no doubt about that. You're absolutely right. You can actually see it happening. For example, if you go to the Middle East Media Research Institute online, MEMRI, MEMRI, it will give you can find videos of Islamic clerics explaining the ways and means of beating your wife, because the Quran says that you can beat your wife if you actually can beat a woman from whom you fear disobedience. This is chapter 4, verse 34. Now, there are hadith, however, there's a famous hadith that we often hear from Islamic apologists in the West, that Muhammad was brushing his teeth, and the Muslims came up to him and said, hey, what do we beat our wives with? Anyway, like they're asking, with our hands, with sticks, what? And he holds up his tooth stick, his miswak, and says, beat them with that. And so this is often quoted nowadays by people saying that, you see, that's not really allowing for beating of the wife. It's just a symbolic tap in order to note to them that they are getting out of line. And this is something that is widely spread. At the same time, however, unfortunately, there are other hadith where Muhammad says things like, no man will be asked why he beat his wife. And Aisha says, I've seen no women suffering more than the Muslim women, and so on. And even that he struck her and caused her pain. And so you find a justification for either one. And this is actually the function of the fact that the hadith are all fictional, because they were fabricated by people who were various factions of Islam and various factions of the groups that ultimately formed Islam. And so they would fabricate various stories to justify their own positions on different matters. And then the rival group would fabricate another story that said the opposite. And so you find multiple contradictions in the hadith literature.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the fact that there are all these different factions within Islam, because that dovetails into the other question that I had for you. Now, a lot of the violence that we see in the world, they tend to come from a very specific interpretation of Islam, what you might call the Salafi or Wahhabi interpretation. But the Islamic world is vast and very pluriform, and there are a lot of different groups there. Now, I happen to have friends from a number of smaller Islamic sects, such as the Ismaili Shi'is or the Ahmadis, who do not espouse this interpretation of Islam. The groups that I mentioned, they tend to be non-violent, and unfortunately because of that, they tend to be persecuted by their fellow Muslims. But the question that I have in my mind is, wouldn't the existence of such groups be considered examples of how one can have a viable, non-violent interpretation of Islam?
Yeah, sure. The Ahmadiyya, however, are quite problematic in that regard, because they, well, in the first place, because of the collaborative work that they do with Muslim Brotherhood linked groups in the United States, but also because of the fact that they're working for the same goal. They make no secret of the fact that they want to see Islamic law imposed over the world, which would mean that all of us would be reduced to second-class status. And they just have a different idea of how the means that should be used to accomplish that. But also, you noted, and the biggest problem with them is what you noted in your question, saying that they were persecuted by other Muslims, that this is something that is considered to be illegitimate by the much larger Islamic groups, that their positions are considered to be illegitimate by the much larger Islamic groups, precisely because they do not espouse the doctrines of violence, among other things, that are mainstream among the larger sects.
Okay, that is a fair point. Aside from these groups, I also know that here in the West, there is this burgeoning movement, you might call it Islamic modernism, and Dr. Hashmi, whom you've debated, actually professes to be an Islamic modernist. And a lot of these mostly Western Muslims try to look at the Islamic religion, and they will try to reinterpret a lot of these traditional sources in such a way that they create a more non-militant, non-violent understanding of it. And in some places, they are, they have a sizable presence. Fun fact, here in Toronto, we have one of the few examples of an LGBTQ-friendly mosque, which I always get a chuckle out of when I pass by them. But be that as it may, my question is, since you've expressed pessimism towards the notion of Islamic modernism, can you elaborate on why you don't think this movement is a viable way forward?
Absolutely, Lewis. You know something, in the first place, I want to note that I wish them all success, that it would be a benefit for everyone. It would be a great boon to the whole world if they were able to prevail. And I'm totally rooting for them. The problems arise, however, when you look at how they're received, at least so far, in the Islamic world. Dr. Hashmi himself, as a matter of fact, I noticed not long after we agreed to debate, and I was following him on Twitter because we were exchanging private messages about how it was all going to be set up and so on. And I noticed that a lot of the Salafis on Twitter were absolutely lambasting him for his modernism and claiming that he was not a real Muslim, and even coming to me and saying, you shouldn't be debating this guy. You said you should be debating a real Muslim. And that on Twitter, it's just words. It's just games. But unfortunately, this kind of thing is played out in real life as well. Take, for example, Mahmoud Muhammad Taha in the Sudan in 1985. He was a modernist theologian. He taught that the Medinan verses, which are generally more violent in the Quran, which take precedence in standard Islamic theology and law right now, that they should be relegated to a secondary status, and that the Meccan verses, which are more peaceful and give the possibility of greater coexistence with non-Muslims, should be emphasized. And he was actually arrested by the Sudanese government and tried as a heretic and executed. Ahmed Assid in Morocco is an activist who taught the same thing just quite recently, just a couple years back, saying that the Meccan passages that are more peaceful should take precedence over the Medinan that are more violent. And he's gotten multiple death threats and lives in hiding. This is the kind of thing that happens, unfortunately, when you have genuine reformers, because Islam has a death penalty for heresy, a death penalty for apostasy. Reformers generally tend to be received as heretics or apostates and placed under death threat. It kind of discourages reform. Now, that's not to say it's impossible. And certainly, like I say, I'm totally rooting for it, but the odds against them are prohibitive because of the nature of Islam itself. Just conclude that with a passage from the Quran in chapter 5, verse 3. Allah says, "This day I have perfected your religion for you." And this has been the rebuke to reformers throughout Islamic history. If it's perfect, what are you changing it for? You're only going to make it imperfect.
I think that most Muslims would at least grant in theory, the idea of reform. It's just that, reform in that context would be, what would you say, going back to the sources and trying to retrieve what they might see as its authentic meaning. So I think in the minds of a lot of Islamic modernists or reformers, this militant understanding of Islam is a sign that maybe the most of the adherents of the religion have lost their way, and they're trying to set them back to the correct understanding of the religion.
Well, when you're talking about going back to the sources, this is what reform movements of another kind have done throughout Islamic history. You take, for example, the Almohads in Spain, early medieval Spain, during the time actually of the conquest in the 8th century. And the Qadizadelis in Istanbul, much later on the 16th century, the Wahhabis, of course, many other, the Mahdi movement in Sudan in the 19th century, many reform movements in Islam have announced that what they're going to do is clear away all the later additions and get back to the original, just like Martin Luther claimed to do in Christianity. And what you get in every one of those cases, that I mentioned and many others as well, is a more virulent and violent form of Islam than you had before. Because when you go back to the Quran and Sunnah, you end up with a very violent religion, because Muhammad fought battles, he enjoined warfare. The Quran is very clear that when it talks about jihad, it's talking about warfare. You know, the easiest example of that is that I say to people when they say, well, when it means fight, it means like argue with them or debate or any number of other things, some kind of spiritual struggle within or so on. But the easiest answer to that is chapter 8, verse 41 of the Quran, from the chapter Al-Anfal, the spoils of war, which actually says that 1/5 of the spoils are to be given to the Prophet. Now, and that actually continues nowadays, that the Islamic authorities take a cut of the spoils of war. What possible spoils of war are there from a spiritual struggle or from a discussion? You know, there's no 1/5 you can give. And so it's very clear that hot warfare is meant.
Right. Well, you know, one could argue that maybe the spoils of war are like the inward, like, improvement of your character or something along those lines. There's also always a way to spiritualize passages like that.
Well, I wish you all success.
Yeah. There is one more question that I do want to pose. Well, maybe one or two, depending on how this goes. So I have spoken with a lot of these liberal or modernist or whatever you want to call them, westernized Muslims. And as far as I can tell, most, if not all of them, seem to be sincere in their beliefs. They really do believe that true Islam should be, you know, nonviolent and peaceful and doesn't force itself on others. Now, I happen to have friends who would think otherwise, and they don't trust these people who hold more moderate views on Islam. And the reason why they don't is because of a concept called Taqiyya, which, you know, is the idea that you could conceal your true beliefs if it is advantageous. And they bring up the concept of Taqiyya as a reason to distrust any Muslim who claims to be peaceful and advocate for nonviolent expressions of Islam. Now, what I'm curious to know is, in your view, are most of these Muslims who advocate for a nonviolent understanding of Islam sincere, or is your view that they're engaging in Taqiyya?
You have to go case by case on this. You know, I'm often accused of this, actually, but it's a false accusation. People say, whenever you see a Muslim calling for peace, you say it's Taqiyya. This is not actually the case. I am accused of accusing people of Taqiyya far more than I ever actually accused people of employing Taqiyya. But it does exist. It's a real thing, and people sometimes say, well, it's only a Shiite thing. Well, it did actually arise in Shiite Islam. There's no doubt about that. But there's also no doubt that because it has Quranic support, from chapter 3, verse 28, where it says, do not take unbelievers as your friends and protectors in preference to believers, unless you're doing it to guard yourselves against them. And Maulana Maududi from India or Pakistan said that this meant that there are some people, in some circumstances, we should pretend to be on the side of our enemies, in his great commentary on the Quran. Now, he's a Sunni, and it's a Sunni tafsir that he wrote, and he's coming out very clearly for the idea that deception is justified against unbelievers in some circumstances. And there are many others as well. Now, the thing is, when you're coming to people who say that Islam is peaceful, I always look at how they explain it. If I have a guy like Mustafa Akyol, very prominent moderate Muslim, and he says, truly, rightly understood, the Quran teaches peace. Well, I know what the Quran says. I've read the Quran hundreds of times and studied it in great detail, read the principal commentaries, all these things, and I know that it does not teach peace. And so I don't think that's honest. Whereas on the other hand, my friend, my dear departed friend, my late friend, Tashbi Syed, who used to be on the board of my organization, Jihad Watch, he was a Muslim who very clearly said, Muhammad teaches warfare, the Quran teaches warfare, we have to confront that as Muslims, and find ways to understand these passages so that they do not incite to violence. But in other words, he admitted there was a problem. Whereas the people who say, well, rightly understood, it's all fine, they're denying there's a problem in the first place. And I don't think that's a path to genuine reform.
Yeah. I just want to make sure I understood one point you made correctly, because you mentioned Mustafa Akyol, and I know that he is another proponent of this idea of Islamic modernism. He actually appeared on Jordan Peterson's podcast recently to advocate for this understanding. Now, you said that because of you having read the Quran, you know that it doesn't say what he says it says. So is it the case that you think that he's deliberately being deceptive when he says that teaches peace, or do you think that maybe he really does think that and he's just being deluded about its contents?
It's either one of those two, but I wouldn't venture to say which, because I'm not in the man's head. I don't know his soul. I know that what he's saying is contrary to fact. And he and I actually debated years ago in Michigan. I'm not sure there's a video available, but in any case, I confronted him on exactly this issue. And this is the key question, that I think there are a lot of very well-meaning people. Leaving aside the question of Mustafa Akyol, because like I said, I've met him. I met him at the debate in Michigan, but I don't know the man. Leaving aside the question of him in particular, I think there are many people who are well-meaning, who are Muslims, who tell themselves that this is all peaceful because this is how they learned it. That maybe, their grandmother, something. I can give you an example. Zuhdi Jasser is another prominent moderate Muslim. And years ago, I was working on an initiative to ask Muslim groups in the United States to repudiate the genocidal hadith. The genocidal hadith says Muhammad is made to say that the end times will not come until Muslims kill Jews, and Jews will hide behind trees, and the trees will cry out, "Oh, Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him." So David Horowitz and I were going to various Muslim groups and asking them to repudiate this, because it's being used by Hamas, been used by others to justify violence against Jews. And the thing was going on. I talked to Jasser, and he said, I will be happy to endorse this if your name's not on it. And I said, what's wrong with me? And he said, I don't approve of your biography of Muhammad, a book I wrote back in 2006, The Truth About Muhammad, because you make Muhammad out to be a warlord and violent and all these things. And I said, well, I used Ibn Ishaq, the first biographer of Muhammad, Ibn Sa'd, the biographical material in the Hadith of Bukhari and Muslim and so on. What else should I have used? What are the sources? And he said, well, those are the sources, but I just think Muhammad was a wonderful man. Well, that's very nice. And I understand how in his particular cultural context, his particular family, he probably heard this all the time, but it's just not borne out by the texts.
All right. It's funny. It actually brings to mind something that I remember the late Nabil Qureshi once said in a talk he gave for his book Answering Jihad. He said that back in the days when he was a Muslim, he really did, he said that Islam was a religion of peace, and at the time he really did sincerely believe what he said. Now, of course, after he became Christian, he wrote a book saying why he doesn't think that was really the case anymore. But, based on a lot of the conversations I have with Muslims, and we have a large Muslim community where I live, I think that a lot of them really do sincerely believe it when they say things like that. Now, is there a possibility that they may be fanatics hiding amongst them? Sure, maybe somewhere in there in the crowd. But, I've not had a reason to suspect that anyone that I've personally met is of that ilk.
There's no reason to assume that.
Yeah.
It's another thing, I'm often accused of saying all Muslims are terrorists, or those that are not are just waiting until their moment. This is all nonsense. There are millions and millions of Muslims in the world who will never wage jihad against unbelievers. And this is nothing that I have ever denied. I'm sure that, if you don't have any reason to suspect that your friends are insincere, then you don't have any reason to suspect that your friends are insincere. That's it. There certainly are examples of moderate Muslims going jihad because of the Quran's various things in Islamic theology, larger than just the Quran. For example, the idea of jihad being the greatest of all deeds that Muhammad is supposed to have said in a hadith. Somebody came to him, and said, "What's a deed greater than jihad?" And he says, "I can't think of such a deed." So if jihad is the greatest of all deeds, and you are a Muslim living in a sinful life, drinking alcohol and ignoring the prayer times and doing various things, and then you have a spiritual awakening, this is a time of great vulnerability. And unfortunately, there's some that have gone to jihad activity at that point because they see it as something that will outweigh all their sins in those great scales I mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, those are all the questions that I have. So if we could probably switch to audience question and answer. Michael, are you there?
Yeah, I have a few more questions. So the one other question that, well, actually there's about 5 of them, but we'll try to be brief. Everybody, if you want to send some chat questions, send them to @Reason and Theology. So what do you think about his comment comparing America to, it sounded like a Christian nation. I don't want to put words into his mouth, but that was the impression I was getting, at least.
Yeah. I think that's a reasonable impression. After all, when I said America's not a Christian nation, there's no establishment of religion, he said, well, you yourself speak about the Judeo-Christian tradition and that America is Judeo-Christian. It's certainly true. America culturally, historically, is largely, predominantly Christian. But this still doesn't mean that the U.S. government is motivated by Christianity or Christian precepts in doing the various things that it did in the Middle East. And so I think that was a fundamentally false premise he was working from.
And again, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but it almost sounded like he identified Christians with white people as if they're the same thing, as if there's
that was another thing he said, your white supremacist Christian civilization. I thought that was highly offensive, but that was in that long give and take in the middle, and it moved on somewhere else, and I had to answer something else. But yeah, that was an incredibly unfair and misleading thing for him to say. Christian civilization, it teaches the equality of dignity of all human beings, and the idea that this is all some white supremacist enterprise is just the fashionable race baiting that we have today with critical race theory and all that.
Yeah, it's kind of what it sounded like. So another thing that I was curious about, I think it was during his closing statement, he brought in a whole bunch of graphs very, very quickly. So it was kind of hard to really look at them in detail, but I don't know if you had a chance to really look at them. What did you think of his graphs? Do you think they were reliable from what you saw?
I wouldn't trust a single thing about it. It's funny you say this, actually, because I didn't see all of that. I don't see well enough, and it was all going by so fast. So I couldn't say that I saw any particular thing in any of that material. But I spoke with a friend after the debate, and he asked me, did you see his chart of the number of terrorist acts in Europe from 2001 up to now? And I said, well, I saw it go by, but that was about it. And my friend pointed out, and he's going to send me a screenshot of this, and so I can verify it, but I don't have any reason to think that he would be misleading me on this. He said that Hashmi's chart skipped from 2014 to 2018, and then had 2015, 16, and 17 in another place, because 2015 is when the mass migrant influx began in Europe, and there was a huge spike in crime and specifically in terrorist activity, as well as the incredible epidemic of sexual assault by the migrants against German women, Swedish women, and so on. And that was taken, those years were taken out of the chart and displaced, which gave a highly misleading impression. And I wouldn't trust any of his charts on that basis after hearing about that.
Yeah, I think the point of the charts was that you only see terrorist activity really increase whenever there's American activity in Muslim nations, and so this is basically them killing ours because we're killing theirs. I think was his argument. What do you think of that argument that he said? Well, you know, a lot of these terrorist groups, their claim is that they're just simply killing our innocents because we're killing their innocents.
Yes, well, that's certainly something that's said. And I was able to answer this during the debate, that this is the nature of defensive jihad, that you have to list grievances in order to justify your jihad. So you frame it in exactly that way. You say, these are the terrible things that the non-Muslims are doing to us, and so we have to go jihad. That's one thing. The other answer is that the jihad was going on long before there was a United States. And I can, in my history of jihad, show that the earlier jihads were by no means defensive. The Ottoman Empire was the biggest power in the world at the time that it was waging jihad against the Middle East, against Eastern Europe, and so on. And this wasn't in reaction to anything. Also, there are many jihads going on today, and I didn't get a chance to say this, that have nothing to do with the American presence, because there is no American presence. One of the most virulent fields of jihad today is Nigeria, and Nigeria, as far as I know, there might be American troops because it's crazy. There are American troops all over, but if there are, it's not a significant number, and they're not significant players in what's going on. But there's a massive persecution of Christians in Nigeria, an incredible number of people killed. This has nothing to do with some American presence in Nigeria. Same thing in Mozambique, where the Islamic State has now occupied the province of Cabo Delgado. Same thing in Somalia. Same thing in Pakistan, for that matter. Even though Pakistan is nominally an ally of the United States, there's the terrible burning to death of the accused blasphemer just right before the debate. I mentioned it during the debate right at the beginning. What does that have to do with some American presence there? That obviously has to do with Islamic principles regarding a death penalty for blasphemy.
So, two more quick questions before we get to those chat questions. What were some of the points that you, I know you've given some now, but in addition to the ones that you've just now mentioned, what were some of the points that you wanted to get to but really couldn't get to? Or some of the other ones?
Well, he did cut me off when I was talking. I think I mentioned this before, actually, though. But he did cut me off when I was talking about the schools of jurisprudence. And I wanted to quote, I actually happen to have them right here. I wanted to quote some of these things that the schools say. And these are not schools like, elementary school or something. These are schools of legal thought within Islam that nominally all Muslims belong to one or the other of them. And they all teach this kind of thing. For example, because the Prophet so instructed his commanders, directing them to call the infidels to the faith, the people must understand that they're being attacked for the sake of religion. This is a teaching of a Hanafi manual of Islamic law. The Hanafis are one of the four major schools of Sunni Muslim jurisprudence: Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanafi, and Hanbali. And so you see, when they say that you're attacking people on the basis of religion, that's not defensive. And that's nothing like even the justifications that he noted of Christians using the Old Testament to justify violence. This is an actual doctrine calling for conquest of non-Muslims. And this is not some outlier, some twisted, hijacked version of Islam. This is one of the major schools of Islamic jurisprudence. I could prolong this over long, but all the rest say essentially the same thing.
So it seems like in the end that he felt he was victorious in the debate. Why do you think that that's not the case?
Well, I don't think that he showed that the question, which is Islam more violent than Christianity? Is Islam uniquely violent, more violent than Christianity? He didn't prove this. He proved, or attempted to prove that the United States foreign policy is very bad, and that some Christians have used Old Testament passages to justify violence. But neither of those actually amount to establishing the question that was at hand, which is Islam uniquely violent? Because even if you granted every bit of his point about Christian violence, as I stated in the debate, it doesn't amount to anything like what we see from Islam in terms of 40,000 jihad terror attacks since 9/11. And that leaves open the question as to why this stopped in Christianity and why it continues in Islam. And the answer to that is because it's not in the Christian scriptures, and it's not in Christian doctrine from any of the Christian churches, and it is in Islamic doctrine from all the sects of Islamic jurisprudence.
Sam asks, does the opposing side point that Hitler and the Holocaust was a product of Christian culture and New World colonization? It seemed like that came up a little bit in the debate.
Yes, it did. Yeah, and this is a complicated question because there's no doubt that there was Christian anti-Semitism. I am not in the least interested in denying that. It's a reprehensible thing, and there were Christians who thought that this is great, what Hitler was doing. At the same time, when I say that there were Christians who thought that this was great, what Hitler was doing, we have to understand that what he was doing in terms of the mass murder of the Jews was largely kept a secret, even from the Germans. And it only came out after the war. Eisenhower, as a matter of fact, would force the Germans to walk through the concentration camps so that they would see what exactly had happened. They didn't know, but when I say that they were for the anti-Semitic policies of the Nazi regime. However, at the same time, this is not in the least to say that the Holocaust was a Christian thing, because Hitler was a neo-pagan who hated Christianity and made no mistake about his determination to stamp it out. He persecuted the churches, and there were many Christians who were fighting against what he was doing, notably St. Maximilian Kolbe, Titus Brandsma, Pastor Bonhoeffer, Pastor Niemöller, many, many others, because they understood that what he was doing was directly against Christian principles. So what he's trying to do is make a facile oversimplification that would blame Christianity for the Holocaust. And like I say, I'm granting this in a partial fashion, but it's just not that simple. And he's trying to do that in order to create some counterweight to the incredibly large, massive evidence of Islamic jihad terrorism, both historically and today.
Considering Phlebas asks, hello, Mr. Spencer. To what extent is modern Islamic violence actually inspired by traditional Islamic teachings rather than essentially non-Islamic cultural influences?
Considering Phlebas. Consider Phlebas, who was once as handsome and as tall as you. That's T.S. Eliot, right? In any case, to what extent is modern Islamic violence actually inspired by traditional Islamic teachings rather than non-Islamic cultural practices? About 100%. Traditional Islamic teachings teach warfare against unbelievers, the necessity to subjugate the unbelievers under the rule of Islamic law, make them pay the jizya and accept various humiliating and discriminatory regulations that mandate their humiliation, so that when they experience their humiliation, they will see that this is all coming because they reject the light of Islam. All they have to do is convert to be relieved of this humiliation. But this is because of the warnings, the threats in the Quran that say that the unbelievers are going to suffer in this world. Those who reject Allah, those who are the enemies of Allah, are going to suffer in this world as well as in the next. And so they have to be made to suffer in this world. That's the whole superstructure of Islamic doctrine regarding the status of the dhimmis, the protected people, so-called. It's kind of protection like in the mafia. You have to pay to make sure that no harm is done to you. And this is standard mainstream Islam. So when you had the Islamic State take over various territories, you had them making the non-Muslims there pay the jizya and accept the status of the dhimmis. This is traditional Islamic theology, in other words. It's not modern cultural influences to any degree whatsoever.
We're going to take a few more chat questions, but y'all make sure to send the chat questions not only to Reason and Theology, but send questions that are specific to the debate or somehow related to the debate, it's not going to be a free for all. All right, so that's why we're not asking some of the questions that are up there. I don't see their relevancy. Here's one though from Alan. Why didn't you challenge Hashmi's lies about supposed forced conversions in Central Europe, Northern Europe, and the Americas? It was done by missionaries.
Yes, I'm well aware, actually. And I was trying to say that. This is another point where I was interrupted, and then he says something else, and I have to respond to that. This is why I say that's an unethical debater's tactic. But you're quite right. That was actually something, you asked me, Mr. Lofton, whether I was, what was something I wish I had done. And this is actually something I had planned to do before the debate, but didn't have an opportunity. And that was to note that Christianity spread in, I think I did say it, but then wasn't able to elaborate. Christianity spread in Europe, spread through most of the world by means of missionaries and people freely converting. There's no record of martial conquest of France or Britain or Italy or any of the places that he was talking about in Eastern Europe either. It was just purely false. Yes, sir.
Can I bring one thing up? Because I actually thought of something. I remember in church history it briefly being mentioned that King Clovis I did this, but if he did, he may have been, the exception to the rule.
I don't know. You may be right. The thing about it is that even if that were so, and it may well be, it does not change the great preponderance of the evidence that Christianity was spread by preaching, by proselytizing, and not by violence. And this is in stark contrast. You look at Egypt, you look at North Africa, those were Christian civilizations. That's where St. Augustine is from, St. Cyprian, so many others. And that's completely wiped out. The Egyptians were 99%, Christians were 99% of Egypt when the Muslims came, where the Arabs came in. And now it's about 6 to 10% Christians. Where did all the Egyptian Christians go? Did they leave? No, they were subjected to the dhimmi status, and ultimately, over time, most of them converted. It's the same in North Africa. The Christian community was completely wiped out. And this was done militarily and then by the institutionalized discrimination of dhimmitude that was forced upon the Christians. And there's no comparison to that in the Christianization of Europe.
There's another one here, but it keeps moving on me. All right. There we go. Are you concerned that Javad claimed to understand Constantine's motivations?
I think it's ludicrous. I'm not really worried about it. He can take that up with Constantine. But yeah, I vaguely remember what you're saying, that he said that he thought that it would be Christianity. He converted because he thought that it would be a useful religion for military conquest. This is completely unhistorical. All the records of Constantine's conversion talk about him having a vision of conquering, which he understood as meaning a spiritual conquest. And he's just embroidering on the available evidence to work his own points.
Your comment on the nature of the doctrine of abrogation, how important is it to this debate?
Nature of the doctrine of abrogation is very important to this. It's chapter 2, 106 of the Quran. Whenever we abrogate or cause to be forgotten a passage, then we give you one that is just as good or better. Now, this is obviously a transparent attempt by the authors of the Quran to account for contradictions and to allow for the changes in doctrine that were going along as Islam developed. Now, the problem is that this is a chronological thing. What comes chronologically later is considered to abrogate what comes chronologically earlier. And in Islamic tradition, the violent passages come later, the Medinan passages, than the Meccan passages. And so there are Islamic authorities going all the way back to the origins of Islam. As I noted during the debate, Ibn Ishaq, Muhammad's first biographer, and many others have said that the offensive jihad is the final stage of the Quran's revelations about jihad. And this is because they come later and thus abrogate the earlier passages. Now, the abrogation, however, we have to understand, it doesn't just mean that it's canceled and you can scratch it out. The abrogation means that the situation that maintains for all time is the one that is chronologically the latest. And so that's offensive jihad. But under various circumstances, if Muslims are in the same circumstances that they were in when the earlier stages were revealed, then those stages also become operative. So, for example, Muhammad in Mecca had a very small group of followers, and he preached tolerance. He wasn't preaching tolerance in terms of the Muslims should tolerate other people. He was preaching tolerance because he had a small and powerless group. And so he was teaching tolerance for himself and for his organization, his followers. But later, when he became more powerful, then he starts getting the revelations about warfare. This is the traditional biography of Muhammad. So when Muslims are a small minority nowadays, they go back to this first Meccan stage and preach peace and tolerance, but become more aggressive the more their numbers grow. And we have seen this happening even in our own day, comparing the stance of Muslims in Europe 20, 30 years ago to now. You can see how this happens. This development happens, the movement from tolerance to defensive jihad and so on.
Louis, did you see any other questions there that you thought were relevant, or do you have any final questions?
There was one regarding hadith. Let me see if I can fish it up. But somebody asked about let me see if I can actually find it. I have to scroll all the way up to.
Yeah, I think I recall what you're.
Oh yeah, there we go. John Rosbarsky. What is the progress of the reform, or should I say the reduction of the hadith literature?
Oh, you mean the project in Turkey? Yeah, that they announced a few years ago that they're going to be reevaluating the hadith and trying to determine the authenticity of various hadith. I haven't heard a thing about that since then. Perhaps Dr. Hashmi or somebody else could fill us in on the latest developments regarding it. But the problem that this endeavor is going to face, if it goes against the received understanding of which are strong and normative hadith that are normative for Islamic law, then they're going to get a lot of friction from traditionalists. And how that will play out, we will see. But the traditionalists, unfortunately, have a very poor record of being violent to those who contradict them.
Ernst asks a question to Mr. Spencer. How would you quickly answer about the supposed violence in the Dark Ages?
Well, there's no doubt that it was there. And as I noted during the debate, the exegesis of the Old Testament to justify it only started in the aftermath of the First Crusade. And so there's no way you can say that that's Christian doctrine. But there's no doubt that there were Christians who were opportunistically quoting the Old Testament. Usually they were doing so after some atrocity that they committed in order to try to give it some justification. This is the nature of sinful human beings. But the church never endorsed this. As a matter of fact, you take, for example, the attacks on the Jews by the Crusaders before the First Crusade, as they crossed across Europe. The various popes condemned all that. And it was very clear that this was not something that was being done as a matter of an authentic Christian expression, but was a perversion of Christianity that was noted as such by the relevant authorities.
Mr. Spencer, thank you so much for your time, for coming on and giving us your thoughts after the debate. I think it was very, very helpful. So I really appreciate you doing this. Go ahead and put in a plug for anything you're working on or want to make the audience aware of.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a website, Jihad Watch, at jihadwatch.org, which chronicles jihad activity every day of the year, every day of my life. It chronicles jihad activity in the United States and around the world in all its various forms. And so that is the only site anywhere in the world that does this. Also, I have a book coming out. Unfortunately, it was actually supposed to be out now. But there are worldwide paper shortages, and now it's not going to be until I think April, maybe even later, but it's the Critical Quran. I'm very excited about it. It's a new and honest translation of the Quran, plus commentary quoting the mainstream Islamic sources so that people can understand what exactly the Quran teaches and how mainstream Muslims understand those teachings. And that should be out sometime early next year. You can pre-order it on Amazon now.
Excellent. Well, once again, thank you for coming on. And Lewis, I appreciate you coming on and co-hosting here.
It's my pleasure.
Everybody, thank y'all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Also, check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you want to support what we're doing here. Till next time, God bless.